In this video, we will be discussing and looking at a graph to help understand the factors that influence the unloading of gases from hemoglobin. So, however, before we begin, it's best to be reminded of the structure of hemoglobin and how that relates to function. So hemoglobin is a protein, has 4 subunits, and each containing an atom of iron that can reversibly bind to a molecule of oxygen. In total, 4 molecules of oxygen can bind when oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, and it is called oxyhemoglobin. When oxygen gets released or unloaded from the hemoglobin, it is termed deoxyhemoglobin. A way to think of this is to remember the partial pressure of oxygen increases in the lungs and decreases at the peripheral tissues. If the partial pressure of oxygen increases, then oxygen binding to hemoglobin should also increase. So let's look at how this relates to the metabolic needs of tissues. Active, meaning oxygen-consuming tissues, have a decreased partial pressure of oxygen, therefore more oxygen gets released from the circulating blood. The temperature of active tissues is also higher, which leads to an increase in oxygen release. And lastly, there is the Bohr effect that states active tissue produces more carbon dioxide, which, if you recall the equation presented earlier in this unit, lowers pH due to the increase in hydrogen ions produced. This condition, too, will call for more oxygen to be released into the tissues. So it would be simple to just think of it as oxygen binding to hemoglobin. However, carbon dioxide must be considered too. The Haldane effect is a phenomenon that describes how the amount of oxygen in the blood affects its ability to carry carbon dioxide. When blood has a higher oxygen concentration, it results in a decreased ability to carry carbon dioxide. This occurs because hemoglobin has a higher affinity for or an attraction to oxygen than for carbon dioxide. As a result, in the lungs, where oxygen levels are high, hemoglobin binds more strongly to oxygen, causing a decrease in the amount of carbon dioxide that can be carried. Conversely, in the tissues where oxygen levels are lower, hemoglobin releases oxygen and becomes more capable of carrying carbon dioxide. So we can use a graph to illustrate the concepts just discussed. The graph is called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, so the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve is a visual image representing how oxygen is transported in the bloodstream. This curve illustrates the relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen and the saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. As the partial pressure of oxygen increases in the lungs, hemoglobin binds oxygen more readily, reaching a maximum saturation. Conversely, in tissues where oxygen is needed, lower partial pressure results in the release of oxygen from the hemoglobin, and that facilitates its delivery into cells for respiration. Here we can see how specific factors discussed at the beginning of this video will impact the curve. The black lines depict a steady state, including normal body temperature and blood pH. These can be disrupted. For example, if body temperature rises, then, let's see, which one is that? Here we go. This is body temperature rising. Then the curve is shifted to the right. So when oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve shifts to the right, it means that hemoglobin has a decreased affinity for oxygen. This shift typically occurs in response to increased levels of carbon dioxide or decreased pH in the blood. Conditions such as exercising or tissues needing more oxygen, right? As a result, oxygen unloads more readily from the hemoglobin, and then the body's tissues will get the oxygen that they need to have energy production occurring at normal rates. So the shift of the curve is crucial for efficient oxygen delivery during times where metabolic demands are increased in the body. Please note that you can also have a left shift to the curve occurring. So in previous slides, blood chemistry and specifically pH were discussed. And now that the respiratory system topics are almost complete, we can take a look at how the respiratory system plays a role in pH balance in the body. If you think about it and remember, the equation here on the slide, it is clear that there is a relationship between CO2 and the formation of hydrogen ions. Okay, please remember that carbonic acid is here too. That is an acid. Well, what does this all mean? So when cells metabolize nutrients, they produce CO2. And then that is a waste product which will diffuse in the bloodstream and increase the concentration of carbonic acid, leading to a rise in hydrogen ions. And this increase in hydrogen ions lowers the pH of the blood, making it more acidic. The body senses this change through the chemoreceptors, and they're primarily located in the brain and arteries, which then signal the respiratory system to increase the rate and depth of breathing. By exhaling more CO2, the body reduces the concentration of carbonic acid and consequently the levels of hydrogen ions, and that helps to restore pH balance.